So we'll start, we continue the session from today. So I am Tanguy Bertrand. I am at l'IRA in Meudon. And before we start, we continue the session from this morning. François has an announcement. So.
The announcement is that we have found this bag, I think it's with macaron. It was forgotten on the boat, so if you can come to me or you raise your hand now.
Okay, so our first speaker for the afternoon is Mark Patton from the Finnish Meteorological Institute. And so it's about the environment during the Beagle 2 landing.
Hello, I'm Mark Patton from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, and so this talk is based on a study that was published earlier this year, where we inferred the winds during the descent of Beagle 2 from by analysing the high-rise images of the landing site. We used a trajectory model to fit that to the high-rise image, and we also modelled the airbag trajectory. And so this talk was originally to show the results from the airbag trajectory impacts and how they may have interacted with these tar formations that you can see in the image, these bright streaks. And tars are interesting because they're thought to have formed several million years ago and can tell us something about the past climate. So I was planning to talk about the properties of these tars, but I've expanded the scope of the talk a little bit to talk about the meteorology at the landing site and the relevance of the tars for the meteorology and connecting the circulations today with maybe those in the past. So this is the content. So I'll talk about the winds at the Beagle 2 landing site and the airbag trajectory, and a bit about dust activity. So FMI, we are interested in the planetary boundary layer, which is the closest layer to the surface because it interacts with the surface, producing a highly dynamic atmosphere. And so we're interested in the PBL because we have meteorological instruments on the Mars rovers, the Perseverance and Curiosity, a humidity sensor and pressure sensor. So we we study the results, the observations from those, and so I'm interested in how circulations affect these observations, and in the past have inferred a number of wind profiles. So what are tars? So they're small, bright, transverse ridges that are predominant on Mars, formed by wind-driven transport, sand and dust. Sometimes perpendicular to the current prevailing winds, provides a record of historical wind regimes. Some tars show limited present-day activity, useful for studying surface-atmosphere interactions. Tars are mostly found near the equator. So here's an image of these tars. So it's difficult to tell which way the wind has formed, which way the wind was blowing when these formed, because they don't have like distinct slip faces like dunes, and they're much smaller than dunes. So here's a image of dunes in a field of tars, and the tars are the ripple-like structures. And so the dunes are about 10 to 20 meters high, and the tars are maybe 5 meters high. So now, inferring the winds during the Beagle 2 landing. I guess you know about Beagle 2, that contact was lost with it in 2003, but it was found on the surface in 2014. So Beagle 2 landed in Isidis Planitia, which is a big impact basin, about 900 kilometers wide and a few kilometers deep. And it makes a nice place to study because there's complex winds there, and you also have Perseverance nearby to add some context. So we actually inferred the winds at Perseverance, and when we first compared the results, we were a bit worried because the inferred winds were much higher than the models were predicting. So the winds were inferred by fitting a trajectory model to ground track data, which was calculated by the EDL team. And we also, for the lower levels, we fit the trajectory to the impact point seen in the high-rise image. So that was a bit worrying. Then at the 11th hour, we got some like high resolution wind model data that seemed to agree with our inferred wind profile. Increasing decreasing the grid spacing helped with this. So we think that the high speeds are due to the topography of Jezero crater. Maybe it's some kind of channeling effect. And then we wondered if there's a similar effect of decreasing grid size at the Beagle 2 landing. So this shows the basin with results from the LMD mesoscale model. It shows the wind vectors at an altitude of 2 kilometers, so inside the planetary boundary layer. And you can see they are controlled by the rim of the basin, and the inset shows the tars at the Beagle 2 landing site. And notice the wind vector at the landing site is perpendicular to the tars, which is interesting. So this is the landing sequence for Beagle 2. So we obviously didn't have any like ground track data from the landing. All we had was the high-rise image of the different pieces of hardware. So in the high-rise image, which I'll show a bit later, you can see the location of the heat shield and the parachute and the back shell. So we fit the trajectory model to those points. We had a separate trajectory for each component of the hardware. So these are the super resolution images generated of the Beagle 2 hardware on the surface. So these were combined high-rise images to create like a sub-pixel resolution image of the hardware to help with identification. So these are the wind profiles. As you can see, they're quite coarse, given the limited points. But we were able to constrain the wind speed and wind direction. So at the surface, the wind speed range is somewhere between 5 and 15 meters per second. The interesting thing is the wind direction. You'll notice it deviates quite strongly from the mesoscale model, which is the higher resolution model. So, and also it proved to be like proved some like complications with modelling the airbag trajectory. It seemed to be going in the wrong direction to end up at the location of the deployed lander. So so this image shows the fit of the model to the components seen in the high-rise image, and we only found I remembered from a previous study that the Spirit airbags, the bounce marks showed on the left, they seem to suggest that it was deflected by some rough ground, perhaps around the craters. It might have bounced inside one of the craters, being deflected off the crater wall. So I thought maybe the surface at the Beagle 2 landing site might be a bit rougher than expected. So I simulated the TARS and found that that the angle of the slope needed was about 5 degrees, but with a more natural varying surface, the angle of the slope angle of the TARS could be anything above 5 degrees, really, but most likely around 30 degrees. Now I'll talk about the dust activity at Acidus Planitia because it's important for tar formation, and also I've found out recently it might have some relevance to the meteorology at Acidus Planitia, because when you have dust in the atmosphere, it strongly absorbs solar radiation and can change the vertical temperature profile quite a bit. So this shows some dust activity a few months before the landing. This shows some small dust lifting events in the southern hemisphere at the time of the landing, and I didn't know about this before we published the paper, and this might have some relevance to interpreting the strange inferred wind direction in the PBL. So this dust that was lifted in the southern hemisphere, it covered Mars in dust haze, including at the Beagle 2 landing site. So the optical depth there was measured to be quite a bit higher than usual. So that's that. And then in the paper that we published on the Beagle 2 landing, we also, one of the reviewers asked us to look at the persistence of the images of Beagle 2 in the high-rise images to help with the identification, to confirm the identification, and they can be seen to persist in the images for like 10 years here, which is a bit unusual because a lot of landing sites, the dust covers the hardware, like the parachute and the heat shield. So that suggests there's some reworking of the surface at the Beagle 2 landing site. So recently, a co-author on the paper, Pete Grindrod at the Natural History Museum in the UK, he's been analysing the dust tracks. We're not actually sort of dust devil tracks. We're not actually sure if they're dust devil tracks or wind streaks. But so there's two sets of data, and each set, the direction is perpendicular to each other, which isn't really seen at other places on Mars. And so it's interesting that one set lines up with the mesoscale wind direction prediction, and the other set lines up with the inferred wind direction. So it might suggest that Beagle 2 landed during like a transient kind of climate. So for the conclusions of this talk, so we suggest that maybe Beagle 2 landed during an atypical transient wind condition, possibly influenced by dust haze or surface dust cover, and the TARS and mesoscale models probably represent the long-term prevailing wind direction in Sidus Planitia. And it may be that in the past the TARS were formed by wind circulation controlled by the topography of the basin. So that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Not, maybe I have one. You reconstruct the trajectory of the airbags, but did you also reconstruct trajectory of the parachute for Beagle 2, and is it consistent with the observed winds or the simulated winds?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, you talked about the trajectory of the airbags.
Yeah.
That you reconstruct the surface, but did you also reconstruct the trajectory of the parachute once it is detached, and once between the moment it detached and the moment it reaches the surface?
Yeah, it was detached, and then the wind continued to blow the parachute as it floated down, because it's very light and it took some time to reach the surface. So the wind blew it in one direction, and then the airbags went off in another direction because of the rough ground.
Any other question for Mark? All right, so then I think we can move on. So the next talk is from William Salgado. from the Earth Life Science Institute in Tokyo. And it's about the oxidation of halite during seasonal and maybe global dust storms as well on Mars.
Back and forth. Okay. If you want, you can also do a pointer like this. So, good afternoon. I'm William. I'm a master's student from ELSI, Institute of Science Tokyo. And today I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing since the last year, oxidation of halite during seasonal dust storms on Mars. As a background, I would just like to remember that the surface of Mars is an oxidized environment, and with that I mean that multiple valence elements such as chlorine are observed in their higher redox states, incorporated into oxidized minerals such as oxychlorine minerals, chlorates and perchlorates. And the detection of oxychlorines on Mars is relevant because of many reasons. For example, they can impact the stabilization of liquid water by brine formation. They can impact the chemical cycle of other elements like iron. It can affect the detection of organic molecules under certain conditions. And finally, it can be a potential energy source for life as it is on Earth. So in today's presentation, I'm going to introduce a new idea of how these oxychlorines can be formed on Mars. And I'm also going to show some preliminary results from laboratory experiments that help to validate this new idea. So previous studies addressed the question of formation of oxychlorines on Mars. The main mechanism proposed is the photochemical mechanism. It was proposed by Kathleen and collaborators in 2010. And in this mechanism, the source of chlorine atoms would be the degassing of volcanoes. And in the atmosphere, chlorine would react with ozone, forming perchloric acid, which would then be deposited and concentrated on the surface. The issue with this mechanism is that photochemistry alone does not explain the high perchlorate concentration and high ratio between oxychlorines over chlorine observed by the Phoenix lander. So other mechanisms were also proposed, such as the formation of oxychlorines during sparks that occur during the saltation of dust or dust devil events, and also the UV radiation of mineral surfaces. And as these other two mechanisms, we are also interested in explore what other mechanisms might explain the formation of oxychlorines on Mars. We hypothesized that dust storms can play a role in the formation of oxychlorines. And in this hypothesis, we think that regional dust storms or global dust storms can lift chloride minerals to the high portion of the atmosphere, where it could react with atomic oxygen. The source of atomic oxygen would be the dissociation of CO2 or water vapor. An analogy here is the reactions that occur in the low Earth orbit between atomic oxygen and materials that are used in spacecrafts and satellites. So we want to test if this reaction can really happen. So to do that, we are using a molecular oxygen plasma as a source of atomic oxygen, and we are irradiating under different times halite disk samples. After irradiation, we perform the chemical analysis trying to identify this oxychlorine formation. We are analyzing the disks after irradiation. We are doing a depth profile analysis using tough seams. We want to identify this species as a function of depth. And since the plasma environment is it's very complex, we do not only have atomic oxygen, we can also have charged particles, electrons. So we acknowledge that some material in our sample can be ejected or sputtered from our sample, and the gas phase reaction can also form this oxychlorine. So because of that, we are also using a cold trap, because if some material is being sputtered off our sample, we can collect this material and analyze by ion chromatography. So going to the results, these are the tough seams results. What we are seeing here on the top is the images of the disks, of the point of the disks that are being analyzed. On the bottom, we can see the depth profile analysis, which relates the intensity of the signal for 3 oxychlorine species as a function of sputter time in seconds. The sputter time here can be thought as the depth of our sample. And since these samples, they can absorb water from the atmosphere, we always, and during the tough seams analysis, we can form these oxychlorine species. We always compare the irradiated sample on the right with a non-irradiated sample as a reference. And what this result shows here is that after 5 minutes of exposure to atomic oxygen, we don't see much difference when compared with the non-irradiated sample. After 30 minutes, we can see the formation of perchlorates, chlorate, and hypochlorite between 0 and around 80 seconds of sputter time. And after 5 hours, we can see that the thickness of the oxidized layer increased. Another important result here is that the order of magnitude of the intensity of the signal for perchlorate is about 1 order of magnitude higher when compared with chlorate, which suggests a preferential formation of perchlorates over chlorates. Another important result here is that when we compare the 5 hours irradiated sample with the 30 minutes irradiated sample, we do not observe an increase in the intensity of the signal in the layers that are closest to the surface. And we interpreted this as if the surface of the halide is already saturated in perchlorate after the 30 minutes irradiation. And I'm going to use this result in the discussion. Regarding the material collected in the cold trap, we only observed the formation of some crystals after a long exposure time, after 12 hours of atomic oxygen irradiation. And the ion chromatography analysis of this material show a peak, a perchlorate peak. And this result tell us that some of the material formed on the surface of the light is being sputtered, and we cannot rule out that the reaction is occurring in gas phase and not an heterogeneous reaction, which is what we want to see. So what we need to do is to improve this experiment, and in future experiments is what we are going to do. We acquired a new plasma system, is a microwave plasma system that I'm showing here on the right. We are going to connect this plasma system to a vacuum chamber that we have in our lab. And in future experiments, we will be able to isolate the sample from the plasma region. This vacuum chamber also will allow us to perform cold temperature experiments. Then we will be able to irradiate also ice mixtures. And it will also isolate the sample from UV light, which also can impact the oxidation of the material. In the future, we want also to irradiate other minerals that are present in the dust. We also want to use other gases like hydrogen, chlorine gas, and we want to start to investigate what chemical changes can happen with the dust when the dust is airborne in the atmosphere. And just for a quick discussion, in our experiments, we demonstrate this reaction to happen, but I also want to think if this reaction makes sense on the Martian atmosphere, because, of course, the plasma tube is a very different environment than the Martian atmosphere. And to do that, I'm going to use my experimental result that showed a saturation time of 30 minutes. And what I'm doing here is to estimating the molecular oxygen dissociation fraction. In my experiment, I cannot calculate the dissociation fraction, but based on previous studies that use the same pressure, the same temperature, the same radio frequency power, I can estimate this dissociation to be 10%. And in assuming 10% of dissociation, I can calculate the atomic oxygen density in my system, the flux of atomic oxygen in an area of my sample, and then knowing the time necessary for saturation, I can calculate the total numbers of atomic oxygen necessary for saturation. Then, thinking about the Martian atmosphere, I'm going to assume current values for atomic oxygen density. I'm using this value from a paper from Mahaffey and collaborators from 2015. And this is the atomic oxygen density for an altitude of 120 kilometers high. In assuming this density, I can also calculate the flux, and knowing the total number of oxygen atoms, I can estimate the time for saturation of a halide surface on this atmosphere, on this Martian atmosphere, which would be around 170 years, which geologically is a very short period. So what we think that can happen is that halide and other chloride minerals can be lifted to the higher atmosphere by dust events. Over time, the surface is saturated in oxychlorines, and after deposition, these two salts can be separated because they have different solubilities, and then a new surface of halide is exposed, and other dust events, and this process will happen again in other dust events. So this would help to explain the total amount of oxychlorines on the surface of Mars, and also the right oxychlorine over chlorine ratio. And this is the summary of my talk. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions.
Thomas Gauthier, Latmos. Thank you. It's really interesting experiments that you're doing. I had a questions regarding the energy of the oxygen atom you have, and how you can compare that both to Mars atmosphere and also for the future experiments you're going to do with microwave plasma.
Yes.
You're going to be changing the energy of the ions.
Yes. I mentioned the LEO environment, the low Earth orbit environment. And one problem that the LEO community has when trying to simulate this environment is that the cold plasma does not reach the energy necessary to simulate LEO environments. But in this case, I don't think that oxygen atoms on the Martian atmosphere would have the same high energy as in LEO. So I think our cold plasma is a good equipment or environment to simulate the Martian atmosphere.
I fully agree with you. I was actually thinking the opposite, that with a radio frequency, you're going to be already at like 810 EV for your ions, and with a microwave, you're going to be even much higher. With a microwave plasma, you're going to be at much higher energy than this. So how does it really compare with atmospheric?
No, the microwave plasma is also cold plasma. We are going to be in the range of 1 in 10. I think, yeah.
And can you make like studies, parametric studies with energy to see how it impacts your results?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer this, but maybe I can change the energy, tuning the power of plasma. And I can test. Yes, it's a good idea. Thank you.
Koyama from Tohoku University. Very nice, interesting talk. And I have a question about inner current understanding. We don't know the source of the cloning for HCl in the current present in Mars atmosphere.
Yes.
And this mechanism, do you think this mechanism could be a kind of a potential source for the cloning for the atmosphere?
This is a very difficult question. Maybe, but as we saw in the last in an earlier talk today, maybe the HCl is not correlated with dust activity, but with some kind of degassing or some kind of releasing of HCl that is trapped on ice. But
in the observation, actually the HCl appears.
Yes. I think I cannot answer this question right now, but with this new system, we can, for example, try to irradiate chlorine element in ice. So I think this is an opportunity to start to investigate and answer this question. Yeah.
Can you quantify like how much chlorine is released in your experiment?
You mean here?
Yes. Calculate and also chlorine oxide and so chlorine atom maybe?
Yes, I'm not showing here, but I estimated what is the amount of perchlorate that the area of this peak correspond, and it corresponds to few layers of my disk. So it's a very small quantity being ejected from the sample. But also, I must admit that I may be losing material during the dissolution of these crystals when I'm removing this cold trap from the system. So this is something that I need to reproduce in the lab and try to improve these results.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker again. So now let's go to the future and let's talk about terraforming Mars with Edwin Kite from University of Chicago and Aster Institute. So for this session, there are two talks. First Edwin and then Ashwin Brod. And the idea here is that we will take questions at the end of the two talks, okay?
Hello, everyone. So as far as we can see, the universe beyond Earth is hostile to life. So when we head out to the stars, our voyages will be very different from those that we're familiar with from history books, where you send your ship out into the sea and then you reach another shore. Because in space, there is no other shore. So we need to create sustainable habitats and biospheres at our destination. And so this is an artist's impression of the near future of Mars that we might enable. but it could be a vision of our own planet about halfway through its history, on the cusp of the great oxygenation event, and after oxygen-producing microbes have established themselves on our planet. So this is the heart of the problem of Mars terraforming, of how to take the process of planet development that has made at least one world habitable to us, but took billions of years, and accelerate it to timescales relevant to us. So when can we do this? The key is a warm climate enabling first small amounts of liquid water and then rivers and lakes. We're zooming in on the Tharsis volcanic province. There are snow-capped mountains off to the left. The extent of water is set here assuming the ice caps melt, but basically no extra water, which gives a relatively dry planet compared to our own. Today I'll talk mostly about Mars climate warming mechanisms and suitability for life in the future. This is the product of a large and growing collaboration and a small but growing community. This is the workshop that we held in Berkeley last month, and some of the output from the first workshop that we held in Pasadena 2024 is in the Nature Astronomy Perspective piece that hopefully everyone has had a chance to get an off-print of. So if we're going to reach the stars, we'll have to maintain common purpose over hundreds of years. And one thing that we all have in common is the Earth. As far as we know, the only planet with sunlit oceans and an atmosphere that we can breathe. For the foreseeable future, Earth will be the planet where almost everyone will live. But if we decide to bring life to other worlds, enlarging our environmental responsibilities, it's agreed that warming Mars would be the first step in making the surface suitable for life. And work on this runs from the pioneering ideas of Carl Sagan and Chris McKay through some new ideas that I'll talk about today. And so the sort of overarching why and how of this is discussed in an essay by myself and Robin Wordsworth, which you can read by basically Googling this title. And in this essay, we propose three principles for organizing greening research. One is that we need to do more to search the solar system for life, and this is especially true in the case of Mars, where we have only done an initial reconnaissance. And so more work is needed both to look for habitats for present-day life, for example, deep groundwater reservoirs, and also to return samples from Mars to look for present-day surface life. The second principle we suggest is we need to do more to read the records of climate change on Mars. So that's been the topic of a lot of the discussion at the conference this week. The polar caps retain an important record of Mars's response to obliquity change, and so we should take care to get as much as we can scientifically out of these archives before we start making changes to Mars's climate. And the third principle is not irreversibly consuming resources for future generations. And so any global terraforming measures should incorporate an off switch, and we should take a gradual approach to make sure that our computer models of climate warming are tested against reality and not just other computer simulations. So we've learned a lot about Mars in the past 30 years, so it's time for a new look. So we've heard about some of these new paleo results this week, but the consensus both from orbiters and rovers is that early Mars was suitable for life, at least in some times and places, but it's lost it over geologic time. Now, if we just wait, according to Bruce Joukowsky's study, for billions of years, as the sun gets more luminous, then it's possible that Mars might again become habitable. So could humans speed up this process? There are three steps. The first, which I'll emphasize in this talk, is warming Mars up to allow simple photosynthetic organisms, microbes. The second step is raising the atmospheric thickness through the activity of those microbes. So this gives an oxygen-dominated atmosphere. And so I'll talk mostly about the first step. Of course, warming Mars is necessary but insufficient for life as we know it. The first organisms to establish themselves in the meltwater on a warm Mars, the pioneer microorganisms, would face many challenges, including ultraviolet flux, high concentrations of perchlorate, salinity, large day-night temperature cycles, low total pressure. Now, for any one of those challenges, you can point to an organism on Earth that does fine and even thrives in that environment. But I'm not aware of any extremophile on Earth that can handle all those challenges simultaneously, and so it's possible that synthetic biology will be required to adapt Earth life to Mars conditions. But if you're interested in that, again, I encourage you to read the Nature Astronomy Perspective for more background. So the picture I just sketched out today, that I just sketched out and is on this slide, is not a new one. It goes back to the first NASA summer studies from the 1970s, runs through the work of Chris McKay and his students. So what are the options for warming Mars? I'll emphasize three today: local warming, orbiting reflectors, and engineered aerosols. Carbon dioxide outgassing by itself is not enough to warm Mars to enable liquid water, as was pointed out by Bruce Chakosky and Chris Edwards in a Nature Astronomy paper. So starting with local warming, Robin Wordsworth's group at Harvard has been leading the charge here. There are a couple of options. One is to lay down tiles on the surface that let in sunlight, trap infrared, and have a low thermal conductivity, reducing the leak rate of heat to the atmosphere. And that can allow for local melt pockets in which microbes could establish themselves. More recently, in the last few months, the Wordsworth group has proposed and prototyped a bioplastic habitat for algae. So the advantage of having a habitat that is made of bioplastic is shown in the flowchart on the right. Basically, the algae that grow in the habitat can be used to make more bioplastic. And so 3D printers can then print more bioplastic habitats, allowing for production of more algae. The algae themselves, once the self-growing habitat is extended to sufficient size, can be used to produce oxygen or food or other things that are useful for humans. And so one can imagine scaling this up to produce meltwater at a local but multi-kilometer scale. And so in this artist's impression, a debris-covered glacier is layered with an aerogel sheet, which leads to melting at the interface between the debris and the ice. The meltwater trickles down and fuels an ice-covered lake within which simple photosynthetic organisms could grow, just as in ice-covered lakes in the wintertime in the northern hemisphere or perennial ice-covered lakes in the Antarctic dry valleys. So local warming at the scale of a flask, at the scale of a field filled with bioplastic habitats produced through this exponential growth method, or at a slightly larger scale, you can have melting of a debris-covered glacier to produce an ice-covered lake. Another method is orbiting reflectors. So this is a 200 meters squared solar sail in flight, interplanetary solar sail, Japanese Space Agency. So in principle, reflectors can be put into medium Earth orbit, then fly themselves to Mars, spiraling up, and then spiraling out to Mars and spiraling down into sun-synchronous Mars orbit. From there, they can bounce sunlight down to space. And so, fortunately, many startups are working on this for Earth, the idea being to extend the useful lifetime of solar farms well into the night. And so that's helping to beat down the cost and mass of this technology. However, the scale is much larger, so we're looking at 100,000 square kilometers of orbiting mirrors to vaporize the South Polar Cap and double Mars's atmospheric pressure. A third option, and the one that we are focusing a lot of our work on, is engineered aerosols. So the pilot study for this technique was published last year, and the basic idea is that you release particles from close to Mars's surface. Just like natural dust, they're lifted into the air by the winds and take a long time to settle. They forward scatter sunlight down to the surface and extinguish thermal infrared through both scattering and absorption. So in contrast to natural Mars dust, which warms the planet on average but cools the day side, engineered dust can both warm the day side and warm the planet on average. In our follow-up study, which is in revision for GRL, but you can see the text on the archive, lead author is Mark Richardson, we studied a wider range of warming particles with a focus on graphene and carbon-based nanoparticles. So the attractive aspect of graphene nanoparticles is they can be made by taking the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and electrolyzing it, which has already been demonstrated at the Mars surface by MOXIE. And so it's not a less complex in situ resource utilization pathway. We're also doing high-resolution plume modeling. So what you see on the left here, a graphic made by Michael Mischner, is a regional high-resolution GCM, so the inmost nest of a nested GCM. The rotation that you're seeing is the planetary tide, so the animation goes on for several days. And the color corresponds to the density of the engineered aerosol. The point is that the engineered aerosol self-lofts, and the reason is that similar to natural dust, which has a solar escalator effect via absorbing sunlight, the engineered particles have a self-lofting escalator effect, but through absorbing thermal infrared. And so the planetary boundary layer thickens at the location where the particles are released, and this helps their global dispersal. We are also looking at getting these particles out of the computer into the laboratory. And so this is batch testing, basically Fourier transform infrared validation of the simulated optical properties of the particles. For more rapid throughput of candidate particle designs, Alex Kling has led the development of an open source 1D radiative convective particle screening tool, so you could find the QR codes at the table outside. But looking ahead, although a lot more research can be done and will be done on Earth, some green Mars research will require missions to Mars. And I think that thinking about possible future greening of Mars motivates a lot of projects, provides fresh impetus to lots of projects that the community want already, including looking for deep groundwater, which has already come up in this conference as a priority, ice mapping, better climate monitoring. If we're going to perturb the climate, we better know what the climate is in its pre-perturbed state. Better equipped weather stations with the ability to monitor dry deposition, a key uncertainty addressed in one of the posters outside. Climate modeling of response to polar warming, which we'll hear about a little bit in the next talk. Soil sample return, of course. We already know the soil is a challenge to life, but there may be additional, excuse me. But there may be additional challenges that we won't know about until we get soil samples back in the lab, and so on. So in summary, it's been understood for over 50 years that there are two steps to allowing surface life on Mars. First, warm the planet up to allow photosynthesis, which is relatively quick and easy, but still take decades, and then build up the oxygen level using photosynthesis that with current technology would take at least centuries. And so our team focuses on the first step, but there is a broader community working on all aspects of this problem. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for both basic and applied science in this area. So with that, I'll leave up my summary slide, and I think we're hopping to the next talk directly. Is that right? We're hopping to the next talk directly. Yeah, thank you for listening. Yeah.
Yes, hold on to your questions. We'll do the next talk from Ashwin Brod from the Aster Institute. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions.
Hi everyone, so thank you for making it to the last talk of the day. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the climate effect of engineered aerosols on the Martian climate, and specifically I'm going to be looking at the distribution of the increase in surface temperatures, as well as the effect on surface ice redistribution, and also the effect on the latitudinal dependent mantle stability. So many of these questions were initially kind of motivated not just for the purpose of human exploration, but also kind of to see whether we can artificially rewind the climate back to a warmer and wetter Mars, and to some extent, kind of, as Edwin said, fast forward the climate to a warmer state perhaps in the future. So the initial kind of studies on this were done by Carl Sagan and Chris McKay. So Chris McKay made a very long kind of review article on this. So their hypothesis was that if there was enough accessible CO2 ice in the surface and accessible subsurface, basically you could just artificially warm the atmosphere just a little bit to kind of liberate these CO2 reservoirs into the atmosphere, and eventually what will happen is you could get this kind of runaway greenhouse effect where you have the buildup of the atmosphere and an increase in the pressure, and this will kind of create this runaway greenhouse effect and a warmer Mars. But now we know that there's, as Edwin said, this theory is debunked because now we know that there's simply not enough CO2 available to actually do this in the surface and subsurface. So basically what we have to do is we just have to find a way of getting Mars warm enough first, and then to be able to kind of establish these kinds of environments for these what are known as these pioneer species, and then let photosynthetic microorganisms kind of take it from there and to build up an atmosphere. So essentially we just want to kind of create these kind of local environments so that these pioneer species can be established. So essentially, how would we choose our warming agent? So essentially, when we have a warming agent in the atmosphere, it needs to be both effective, so it needs to be as transparent as possible to incoming solar radiation, and it has to trap as much of the, scatter and absorb as much of the thermal emitted long-wave radiation back near the surface. And it also has to be easily manufactured and not be too energy intensive, and it has to be manufactured using resources that are abundant on the surface of Mars. So we don't want to be importing material from outside Mars. We want to have something that we can manufacture using either directly from the atmosphere or from materials that could be mined directly from the surface. And also, if we change our minds, if we see that there are unintended consequences to modifying the Martian climate, we will need to make sure that when we turn off this warming, or when we stop trying to warm Mars, the Martian atmosphere actually goes back to its original state. So first of all, we want to make sure that Mars remains cold, starts becoming cold again, and also whatever warming agent is present in the atmosphere either degrades or settles out into the atmosphere and then degrades on the surface or oxidizes and becomes part of the Martian environment again, and to make sure, so as Edwin talked about before, for this region, engineered aerosols appear very promising. So this particular review paper looked at the effect of these what are known as these aluminium nanorods. And what they found was that if you loaded enough of these nanorods into the atmosphere, you could get seasonal warming in the regions that you could actually, in specific regions of the Martian atmosphere, Martian surface for as long as, for a certain amount of time, that would be enough to kind of have liquid water seasonally to be able to establish these kind of habitats. But the question is, what would this aerosol loading actually do to the overall water cycle? So actually there is quite a bit of analogy with recent Mars, with increased obliquity in the Martian atmosphere, but of course this is going to happen on a much faster time scale. So first of all, the increased heating of the North Polar Cap is going to cause an increase in sublimation of water vapor into the Martian atmosphere. So this is going to increase the overall global humidity. And we also know that it's probably going to lead to some very complicated radiative feedbacks from cloud formation. It might have a cloud greenhouse. You might have a cooling effect from water ice clouds. And also, it's going to cause a redistribution of our surface ice reservoirs, and it could also cause some destabilization in the subsurface ice. Or it could even actually increase the stability of the subsurface ice reservoirs in the short term. So for this model, we use Mars WRF. So in our model, we have a north polar ice cap full of water ice and a high albedo south polar cap. And within this model, we basically release these aerosols at a constant rate over time. And eventually what's going to happen to these aerosols is that they're going to settle out of the atmosphere. So either through gravitational sedimentation or through what we call dry deposition. So this is essentially Brownian diffusion into the surface. So this is much more a much more important factor for very, very small particles. And so for these nanorods, initially we simulate them using cylindrical 8,000 times 60 nanometer aluminium nanorods, for which we have optical constants and scattering properties from a paper that's currently in revision, but is actually available in archive as well. So what we see is that as we start pumping in these aerosols into the atmosphere, we find that the temperature actually reaches a steady state after about 3 or 4 years. So actually very quickly we start to get increased warming into the atmosphere. Now the water cycle takes a lot longer. So the water cycle takes several decades to actually get towards steady state. And we find that after about 60 liters per second, when we have a scenario with 60 liters per second of nanorods emitted into the atmosphere, we can reach a globally average temperature of about 230 Kelvin. And this is enough to produce the kind of the seasonal warming at Hellas that we would need to start kind of establishing a habitat. So Hellas is kind of very good for real estate because it's the deepest region on Mars, it's the highest pressure region on Mars, and it's also seasonally the hottest region on Mars. But of course, it goes through a lot of seasonal fluctuations in temperature. Now, what we actually find is that the effect of water vapor feedbacks on surface temperature is surprisingly modest. So we do get some cooling of the surface due to water ice clouds in winter, but overall, we get surprisingly little change to the overall radiation budget due to the emission of water vapor from the North Polar ice cap and the resulting condensation of clouds. So what we find is that on a artificially warmed planet, the warming is primarily focused over the equatorial regions. So the equatorial regions are the regions that are going to be the most have the most seasonally stable warming. So over the mid-latitudes, you're going to have a very large seasonal cycles in warming and cooling. And then over the poles, actually, the poles are going to stay pretty cold. And so what this means is that the North Polar layer deposits are going to stay relatively stable. And the CO2 cycle is also going to remain because you're still going to get CO2 condensation, a seasonal CO2 condensation over the poles, especially over the South Pole. And yeah, so what we actually get is, like with the high obliquity models that were talked about yesterday, we actually get an increase in seasonal surface ice. So in the mid-latitudes, we actually get a very large amount of surface ice formation in winter, which does retreat in summer, but we still have permanent ice caps, permanent water ice caps that remain. So how would the warming of Mars actually affect the accessible subsurface ice stability? So essentially, we've heard a lot of talks about the latitude-dependent mantle yesterday, and essentially we want to partly keep this because we want to be able to use this for human exploration. We want to be able to make use of these water ice reservoirs and also to establish habitats. And so on a kind of an interannual scale, we find that the subsurface regions where subsurface ice was shallow subsurface ice was primarily unstable actually become more unstable because these are the regions where you get more warming, whereas at the poles where you previously got stable ice, they actually become more stable because while you get relatively minimal warming in this region, you actually get a large amount of emission of several orders of magnitude of emission of water vapor into the atmosphere, which actually stabilizes this region to sublimation. Of course, we haven't taken into account lag deposition into this model. This is something we will have to do for future work. So finally, what if we change our mind? So what actually happens when we start turning off this release of aerosols into the atmosphere? So what we find is actually the warming is completely reversible. So once we stop emitting aerosols into the atmosphere, the surface temperatures actually go back completely to normal within the space of about 2 or 3 years, which is very interesting. Because what happens is the aerosols simply just settle out of the atmosphere. But what we find is that actually the surface ice redistribution appears to be quasi-permanent. So what happens is that as you start sublimating water off the North Polar ice cap, it's going to start redistributing that ice towards the South Polar ice cap. And what we actually find is that when we turn off the nanorod release, the South Polar ice actually continues growing because there's still this residual humidity in the atmosphere, and there's also this residual amount of ice that's being deposited in the mid-latitudes that gets redistributed towards the South Pole. And so this means that the water cycle is going to take much, much longer to get back to its original state, if it ever does. And finally, what we actually find is that when we release nanorods into the atmosphere from an equatorial region, we find that the Hadley cell circulation actually preferentially deposits these aerosols towards the poles. So essentially, during a northern summer, the Hadley circulation kind of transports these aerosols towards the poles, and also you get some large deposits in low elevation regions such as the Hellas and Argyre, and near the release point due to the efficient mixing of the atmosphere and the efficiency of dry deposition in these regions. So, of course, we don't actually know what's going to happen, completely know what's going to happen once they actually get deposited towards the ground. They could be relofted again. They could degrade and oxidize to form aluminium oxides. We don't know. And this requires further investigation. And so the main takeaways from this presentation is that we find that in our model, warming Mars with engineered aerosols does actually work. We can actually get seasonal warming of Mars in the regions that we want to for part of the year, but the poles are still kept relatively cold, and this means that the polar layer deposits are mostly preserved. So we actually find that the water feedbacks only have a relatively modest effect on the surface temperatures, and we find that when the aerosol release gets shut off, the climate system more or less goes back to its original state, although there will be some changes to the water cycle. So thank you very much, and I just want to kind of conclude this slide saying, we're very much trying to kind of expand the field of terraforming research. So the idea is that we want to kind of do more research before we do anything drastic and to the Martian climate. So essentially we want to kind of take this research into our own hands. I'm not going to read out all of that stuff, but this is just to kind of tell you that there's a ton more to do on the modeling front. There's a lot that we still don't know about the Martian climate, and there's also still a lot we don't know about the physics of the engineered aerosol release. Yeah, and finally, we also don't know what's going to happen, as we said, we don't know what's going to happen with these aerosols once they fall out of the atmosphere. How long is it going to take them to degrade? So essentially, what are we looking for from the community as a whole? Well, essentially, the main thing we're looking for is model intercomparisons. We want our results validated externally. So to do that, we have many resources at this link. I believe there's a printout with a QR code out in the lobby, which you can access yourself. So this is going to give you access to a 1D radiative transfer model to kind of screen various different, and also various different optical constants that you can kind of plug into your model. We also need a lot of constraints on the planetary boundary layer. So to basically try to better understand the initial release of these aerosols into the atmosphere. And we also definitely need a lot more constraints on dry deposition in quasi-Martian conditions, because this is one of the biggest uncertainties in the lifetimes of these aerosols in the atmosphere. And of course, in general, we need improved constraints on the present climate system, especially the dust cycle, and on the total water ice and CO2 ice inventory in the surface and shallow subsurface. So thank you very much, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions for our two speakers, Edwin and Ashwin.
Very interesting talks. I will need a few decades to digest what I just heard. But there are a few things that you need to model better. For instance, you put only pore ice filling, and as you know, you put in your ice distribution, subsurface ice. Only location where you have subsurface ice, where you use Shore-Gopher and Aronson model. But in fact, most of the ice is out of equilibrium ice, more in the mid-latitude where you have a lot of warming. So first, I encourage you to put ice over there to see what's happening, because the temperature rises significantly in those locations. Second thing that I guess the model does not take into account, when you release a lot of aerosols into the atmosphere, they fall down. And when they fall down, they change the albedo dramatically. Yes. And this completely changes the water cycle, and this has to be parameterized somewhere. If not, the model just gives a not accurate result. And the last thing that I'm worried about is the fact that when you put aerosols into the atmosphere, you also change the microphysics, because these are not natural, and the way ice grow on these particles could be different and could make even warmer or colder clouds that will affect the temperature. That's what I get like on top of my head, but I need to digest, like I said, decades.
Thank you. So actually, I was actually going to mention that part regarding your second point. Part of the thing I was actually going to mention is that assuming these nanorods, these engineered aerosols don't get self-lofted again, then yeah, you're going to get all this stuff deposited onto the polar ice caps, and yes, that's going to change the albedo, and that could potentially destabilize it. So that's why we need further investigations of what would happen in this case. So in the third case, yeah, so actually one of the next things we're actually going to do is to kind of increase the complexity of the microphysics. So our dust and ice coupling isn't very advanced at the moment. And also, as you say, like the aerosols can actually act as cloud condensation nuclei themselves, especially if they get lofted very high up into the atmosphere. And also probably what's going to happen is we're going to end up probably charging them a little bit. And when the aerosols get charged, they're going to actually become more effective as condensation nuclei. So yeah, so all of this is coming up, and all of this is in the works. Thank you.
And for the first point, I agree that the ground ice distributions are conservative, but I also agree that the real ground ice distribution will lead to more melting, if that makes sense, which I think is what you're saying. Yeah.
So in some locations where you show 40, 50 degrees change in temperature, you have subsurface ice that is quite close to the surface, and this could create real huge plumes of water and maybe affecting the model overall. So I just changed the subsurface ice distribution.
Jim Head, Brown University. I just had a question. Given the observed changes in the Earth's atmosphere, does your research give us any insight into how much time we have before we have to be off planet? Like, how much time do you have to figure this out, you know?
Mars is not a plan B for Earth. It's an environment more hostile to life than the coldest places in Antarctica on Earth. So thinking about humans moving out is not a backup plan. It's a sort of just something that we can do in a hopeful future.
Yeah, well, I would just say if you get any insight based on, you know, these comparisons, it would be really useful. Give you more time to figure the whole thing. Yeah. Another quick comment is that, you know, when John Young, the Apollo 16 astronaut, came back from the moon, one of the reporters asked him, why did we go to the moon? And he just said, single planet species don't survive. That was so, that's a good motto, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
So I have a question for you, Edwin. So at the beginning of your presentation, you had big statements about how we should make sure we protect the records from the ice in the poles, and then also we should make sure there is no life on Mars to protect it. And at the same time, you seem to put so much effort, like asking funding from billionaires, pushing the ideas to manufacture the best aerosols, doing 3D GCM simulations, ELAS simulations, pushing to send missions for having tests to raise aerosols on Mars. So I would like to, could you please like clarify what is your position? Because this seems to be, not coherent, these two positions, like protecting Mars and at the same time doing all these efforts and to push to make this idea, not only working, but working as fast as possible.
Well, I can't speak for the whole community, but as a starting point for what the community thinks, I would go read the astrobiology paper for the East Coast workshop on applied astrobiology organized by Robin Wordsworth. You can go read the West Coast workshop, essentially Proceedings of, which is the nature astronomy piece that's resting on the table outside. Or you can go read the essay, which is more personal, I guess, by myself and Robin Wordsworth, which I linked to earlier and is also resting on the table outside.
Well, you did not really reply to my question, but...
Okay, but did you read the articles?
Yes.
What is your question based on those articles?
So I would like to understand how you can make these two pictures, like at the same time you claim that we need to protect the archive from the glacier and make sure we won't affect life form on Mars, but at the same time you push this idea so much. So I don't understand how you can have both at the same time.
It'll take realistically decades to develop any technologies to establish sustainable habitats and biospheres beyond Earth. It will take realistically decades to come to some conclusion about whether life on Mars exists. And so you can pursue these research topics in parallel. We're advocating for research, we're not advocating for deployment. We don't know enough to advocate for deployment. Or I would argue against deployment.
Well, in your talk you were mentioning, so sorry to jeopardize the mic, but in your talk you were mentioning missions only a few years from now, and you were proposing the idea, unless I misunderstood,
research
do some tests,
not deployment missions.
Within a few years from now, so...
Yes. So
it seems incompatible to me.
Well, how long do you think it will take humans to make a determination whether or not there is life on Mars?
Well, I don't know. No
I
one
don't know
knows.
either. But it will take at least a few decades to bring the early stage ideas that we are talking about today to maturity to support some kind of decision. And so that's why we should start now.
Hi, Jokoski, Colorado. First of all, thank you guys for a very clear description of your concept. That helps a lot in terms of trying to understand it. And I have a basic question about how you would go about it if it gets that far. If I did the math correctly, the amount of aerosols you would need to produce would be the equivalent of something like a cube of aluminum a couple hundred meters on a side every few years because it's going to settle out. What's the source of the aluminum?
The soil.
So that's a lot of strip mining to get a cube 200 meters on a side.
That's true, and another option is carbon. So we know that MOXIE, which is the carbon dioxide electrolysis device on Perseverance, does its job. And we also know that if you slightly increase the voltage on MOXIE, you get soot. And that is being developed by a startup, Noon Energy, as a battery for use on Earth. So that is attractive because it has energetic benefits and it's more simple. The reason we don't want to put all our coins on the carbon nanoparticle option is that you need to dope the graphene to give it a strong resonance. And that, although it can be done at small scale, it's not clear that it can scale up. But yes, the atmosphere in principle could be a source of nanoparticles. And I find that elegant because you're basically using sunlight from solar panels and air, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to create the conditions that allow for liquid water.
And a quick comment, I think I agree with what you were saying on that last question, that for the next few decades, if you want to do terraforming, the types of things you would want to be exploring and learning about Mars are the same as if you just want to understand Mars. So in that sense, I'm all for it.
Hi, Lonneke Roelofs from Utrecht University. My question is maybe an uninformed version of the gentleman before, because I have to admit I've not read the papers and the essays. What is your motivation behind wanting to terraform the red planet?
Well, I mean, the idea is that, in the future, once Mars has essentially been fully studied and once Mars has been fully understood, then we can try and find a way where we can, so instead of living in these kind of enclosed domes, for instance, where we have these kind of enclosed colonies, we can kind of have a region of the planet where we can actually live in kind of more, well, not quite Earth-like conditions, but closer to Earth-like conditions. But this doesn't have to be necessarily globally terraformed. It could be kind of regionally confined.
And yeah, maybe that's a lack of personal feeling for this. Why is that important to you? That we can do that.
Why not? Do you want to answer that?
Well, we're exploring space for science and also to see if it's suitable for large numbers of people living in space. This is one possible way in which large numbers of people could live in space. There are others, of course.
And then is the sort of ultimate motivation to protect our species against extinguishing ourselves, which we're doing right now? Or so just I'm wondering what the deeper motivation is behind the project, because I feel like there should be, especially because I think also of course the science that you do with this is amazing, but I think the framing also has political and societal implications, and especially in a time where democratic institutions are being challenged from all sorts, this kind of could also be seen as a scientific justification for certain really strange ideas, and I'm wondering how you deal with that side of this research project in a way.
So any establishing large numbers of people living in space project is something that spans at least decades, realistically centuries. I mean, we're 3/4 of a century into the space age, and the population of space is 12. Right? And so that means it's going to, require common purpose and average out over many, many political oscillations. And at the far end of that, many of our assumptions about politics and society, and even the nature of our own consciousness will change. What won't change is the basic physics and chemistry and biology that has to underpin all this, and that's what we're studying.
Yeah, I agree with that, but then I would like to make my last point that we do live in this society, in our own time scale, and I think right now might be a tricky place, at least in my point of view, and I would just hope that you guys keep that in mind as well, that we don't produce science that can also be used as a sort of vanity project for...
I mean, so part of the idea is that we would be in control of doing the research ourselves. But yeah, I mean, we would need the consent of, first of all, the scientific community to do kind of full-scale terraforming. And the consent of the public as well, not just in the West, but also, in other countries, in developing countries. So yeah, I want to make sure that, this is not something that we're just going to do. We're not just going to terraform Mars unilaterally.
And we don't have the ability to do so.
Exactly.
And the Outer Space Treaty, which all countries have signed up to, already provides a framework for that, because the first sentence says, the exploration and use of the celestial bodies, including the Moon and Mars, shall be the province of all humankind, and for the benefit of all countries, irrespective of their degree of development, which they mean economic development.
Yeah, that's a beautiful text, and I hope that our political leaders and our capitalistic big heads also agree with that.
Yanong?
Hi, I'm Jie Dong. I'm from LMD. Also, I'm in another lab at LPCDE. So I might have a comment in the dynamic effect of this aerosols. Like this is a very kind of equivalent to a ejection event produced by wildfires. Like if we put some aerosols in the atmosphere, if we put less, it quickly dissolved globally, then you will see no temperature effect. If you put it very high density, then suddenly it, due to the heating effect, it becomes to a anticyclone system, a vortex. Then it rotated, then it goes with the background flow, then it goes around globally. So I think it would be very difficult to control the location of that system. Like we cannot let some air source stop at a fixed location. Make us produce. It will be moving, always moving.
Yeah.
After maybe 6 months and 1 year, due to dynamic effect, it will be expand into a, the air source will expand to globally. Then due to the circulation, it will be sedimentation to the pores.
Yeah.
As you simulated.
Yeah, so I agree. So essentially, one of the things that we're trying to simulate is, first of all, is what happens in the initial ejection. So part of the problem is that we don't actually know enough about the initial planetary boundary layer physics to really understand what happens in the initial emission of these aerosols. So essentially, initially it's going to kind of distribute around kind of the lower latitudes first. So the Hadley cell circulation isn't as efficient on Mars as it is on Earth, although putting in nanorods putting in any kind of engineered aerosol into the Martian atmosphere would actually would actually make the Hadley cell circulation more powerful. So in terms of the wildfire particles, I think the question was, why would this produce a warming effect, whereas wildfire particles don't? Was that the question?
My question is, it's very difficult to control that system like into a very fixed location.
No, yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah, no, I agree. So one thing that I'm actually trying to look at right now is to see whether if we emit it in something like Hellas, if we tailor the size of these particles so that the sedimentation time scale, you can basically balance the sedimentation time scales with the amount of heating that you can actually create. To what extent can you actually regionally confine this heating? Obviously you won't be able to completely confine these aerosols, but to what extent can you actually minimize the effect to which these aerosols get distributed around the planet versus whether or not it can get focused. So one of the things that we're actually trying to do right now is we're looking at, we're in a collaboration with a group looking at aggregates. And so these aggregates would be much larger particles, and which could potentially also produce the kind of the super greenhouse effect that we want, and obviously these would have much larger sedimentation timescales. So yeah, so yes, you're right, it's very difficult to control, but if you can kind of tune the settling timescales, potentially you could control it to some degree, but we're still trying to investigate that. Thank you.
We still have time for a few more questions. We decided to continue the discussion, so please go ahead, Sandrine.
Hello, Sandrine Gallet from LMD here in Paris. So actually I wanted to ask a similar question as the person who was just here before me as to why. And you already answered that. And so I would like to develop a bit still on this point as to the motivations. Because in research, we can do research on anything. I mean, anything. I could do research on biological weapons and argue that it's just pure research. I want to know what is dangerous, so it's important to do research on this. But you see my point. It's not because you can do research on something that you have to do research on it. To me, the ethical question to be asked, and since the beginning of space exploration, the goal was to, just explore, learn, and planetary protection rules are saying that, okay, we want to discover there's life, but not interact and not, and your research is going completely in the other direction. And to me, there should be some kind of debate. It's really important questions. And I'm kind of worried to see this research emerge now, because it's not neutral at all. So I know you already answered, but I think it was important also to make my little voice be heard and to talk about it, about the implications.
Yeah, I think the starting point is the Planetary Protection Independent Review Board from 2019, something called the Stern Report, which I think has been adopted by NASA. And so the theme running through the PPIRB report is when humans land on Mars, that will inevitably introduce orders of magnitude more microbes to the Mars environment than all robotic missions have done or will ever do. I think that's a pretty straight quote from the executive summary of the report. That doesn't mean that planetary protection is irrelevant. In some ways, it's a impetus to do search for life research now before humans arrive on Mars, and also an impetus to characterize in more detail what happens to the microbes that are released when humans open the airlock door. But that's definitely the context. If you're going to send humans into space, then we will carry with us our microbiomes.
I'm also against sending humans on Mars, obviously. I'm also not really fond of sending humans on Mars. I don't think that's a priority. I mean, it's this kind of projects, it's so much money also behind it that I think there would be other ways to use this money for Earth research. And given all your expertise on that, have you ever thought of, working on Earth climate research to, I don't know, because I saw behind this project, if there is deployment one day, it will be so much money. It means like it will be first priority of humans to do that, and that's scary. It means that's to me it's like a pessimistic future and not a bright future. This thing. Anyway, it's just to give you my opinion on that.
So this work is currently 62% funded by Astera Institute and 38% funded by University of Chicago Climate Systems Engineering Initiative, which is, of course, as the name suggests, about thinking about climate change mitigation for our planet. And so I can't remember the exact title of the grant I got, but it's about looking at positive intersections between, climate mitigation on Earth and climate change on Mars, to your point.
Yeah, Thomas Gauthier, Latmos. My question regards very similar topic, like ethical implication. I fully agree with most of Sandrine's statements, and I think it's very clear with a project this size, there will be tremendous ethical ramification that will need to be, as you said before, made very clear toward the public, toward policymakers, toward also how scientists represent consensus toward policymakers. And so my question is, in your project currently, what do you implement ethically to prepare this discussion that needs to be made?
Could you give an example?
Beside quoting COSPAR text, what is your ethical plan?
Meetings like this one, open science, so we share everything we find. We don't patent everything. We don't patent anything, sorry. Publications like the ones that you see.
I'm more talking about consensus making in the community and toward the public.
Workshops, conferences. So at AGU, we're holding a special session on terraforming, so everyone should come. But we're talking about research, computer modeling, and lab work. We're not talking about deployment.
Even computer modeling and lab work start infusing ideas to the public. So as scientists, we also have the responsibility to think about what we're infusing towards the public.
So in terms of public outreach, we're starting small. So we talk to student groups, some small public events, but the focus is on people like the people in this room, so researchers. Yeah.
Hello, Connor Metz, University of Michigan. You guys are taking I think, I appreciate that you're saying that we should wait until Mars is fully explored and do the research on it and see how it goes. But this is a topic which is has a lot of financial gravitas. There's a lot of people who can make a lot of money off this. And, when there's money involved.
I disagree. I think that it's impossible, or I'm not aware of any way to make a profit of warming a planet. It's a public good. It's kind of the opposite of releasing carbon dioxide into Earth's atmosphere, which is a sort of negative externality, which can only be captured through a tax or some other sort of collective action. So warming Mars up or warming a large region of Mars up is a positive externality, which again, you can't capture it just for your local base. And so that's why everything that we're doing is non-profit. It's not for profit. And in the future, I can't imagine how it could be used to make a financial profit.
I think that in the long-term future, there's a lot of ways that settling other places can be used to make money. Look at human history. I mean, that's what people do. Exploit different places for their own gains. So, maybe not in the next 10, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, but hundreds of thousands of years, whatever. I just don't. When people start seeing dollar signs, they're not going to pay attention to rationality, that you guys are presenting.
Yes, but I don't think there's a way to make a profit from this. So you said that in thousands of years, someone might make a profit from settling other worlds, but for the foreseeable future, I don't see a way to make a profit from warming Mars up.
Not from just warming Mars up, but what's going to come after that?
Okay, we can continue the discussion at the break. Maybe we have time for 2 small questions. If you or someone else has, we have 2 more minutes for questions.
Okay. Ana Grau Galofre, LPG. I agree with what my mostly European colleagues said in terms of, I think that your significant brain power and resources better spent. So I do agree they would probably be better spent looking into ways to geo-engineer climate change on Earth and try to think about solutions in which you could use what you've been doing so far to actually think about how to backpedal what we've gotten ourselves into. But I'm not going to repeat what it's been said, I agree. I'll play along. Think about ice. And you've thought a lot about what's going to happen to the polar regions. But you're explicitly going to put any habitable environments next to glaciers or next to places where you have access to subsurface water. Those places would be unstable. Have you thought about stability, timescales at which that would be relevant? Like, how long would it take for those places to be anywhere near habitable and without?
I guess that would depend on, first of all, how deep the ice is. And what we're actually finding from, obviously we need a much more sophisticated subsurface ice model, but what we're finding preliminarily is that there's not a huge amount of change to the overall subsurface ice stability. But obviously we'd need to investigate that more, because the increase in the humidity of the atmosphere. Basically, the increase in the temperature is counterbalanced by the increase in the atmospheric humidity. But obviously, over seasonal timescales, yes, there would be some instability in the ground. But yeah, but it would need more investigation, yes.
I think that's, I would expect like large-scale instability and fast sublimation.
It depends on the burial depth, how much wetter the atmosphere gets and whether you raise the annual average temperature above freezing. So this connects to our uncertainty about deep subsurface structure. The shallow ice that we see could be underlain in principle by empty pore space. In that case, you can't stably raise the temperature above freezing on annual average because the water will, over long time scales, trickle into the subsurface. Or the ground ice that we see could be underlain by liquid water, in which case you don't have the trickling problem, but you have a potential habitat that for sure would need to be investigated before extending life, Earth-derived life to Mars.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think we have to move on, but we can continue the discussion during the break. So let's thank our speaker again. And I think we will convene in half an hour at 5.
So I think we can resume. Before the panel discussion, and I invite the panelists to sit, I would like to say a few words. So first, I want the editors of Icarus has offered that we could have a special issue about this conference. Special issue are just a good way to publish things maybe sometime more easily. Nowadays it's electronic, so it's published when it's published. So keep that in mind. I will send an email to everyone here, and you could reply if you are interested, if in the coming months you have a good paper to publish. I think it will be a good venue. And depending on the number of positive answers, it doesn't have to be a commitment. You can say, I'm sure I will soon. Yeah, we will decide if we do it, and then we'll deal with the Icarus editors that are interested. Secondly, before I would like to say a few words of thinking. Well, let's do that now. In particular, I would like first to thank the Science Committee. I won't say every word, but it was super useful to... So most of them are here. You can check their name on the website. Some could not come, but it was interesting. This summer, it was in the middle of summer, which is in France a real big problem to do something in early August. But we could have a very useful discussion and lots of the good things that happened during this conference. Some inviting more people, and actually this table now is coming from the discussions. I want to say a special word about the local organizing committee. Because, in fact, I could almost put, well, no. Because you have to know that when you organize such a meeting here, we don't have staff to help, really. We have to do everything, which is fun if you don't do that every year. So I will like to give names, don't applaud everyone, just to really thanks everyone. Everyone really participated. By well, first the chair, officially Ewan Milur, who did, is always, like always, For those who know our team, as always, he does everything behind, and just we are there pretending we do things, but Ewan is doing everything. In particular, that case, it was the handling the different website for registration and everything. And Mike Wolf was also involved, and he did many things, including connecting early in the morning to the local organizing committee. And then by alphabetical order, we had Jean-Baptiste Clément, who actually has been organizing all the live stream, and many people has connected and appreciated. Christopher Edwards has agreed to share this final session. Alexandre Gauvin has actually organized and keep track and control, manage for the caterers and for the dinner yesterday evening. Thank you, Alexandre. And then we have Mirai Kobayashi, who has been the Japanese connection. Okay, can upload it. Lucas Lange, who was at JPL, so the most important point that he participated to meetings even in the middle of the night for him. Middle of the night for me is 5 o'clock. 5 a.m. was, so he actually got up very early and contributed to many thinking. Then we have Yoncheng Luo, who was our Chinese connection. Then Jonah Moxion, I don't know if you know him, he didn't speak, he organized all the signage, so you could find the place and the place on the tower. Thomas Pierron advised Jonah Moxion for the signage because he was in charge last time. André Zantaille, who's here, was the connection with all the printing and to get all the information from the printers. Martin Turbet helped to organize the drinks tonight along with all the guys. Then we have Eran Vos, who organized the gathering of the file, and you've seen him handling the computer. And Di Wong from Latmos organized the goodies. These were the stickers. Maybe some of you got some about the. So she brought that. Thank you to all. Thank you very much to all. So now it's time for the panel. You are in charge. In fact, I suggest that before you go to the panel is officially about the remaining questions and what we could do to address these remaining questions. But before that, you should take a microphone, or you can come here. I would like to ask everyone, including you, to say in a few words, what is the main finding? You don't have to cover everything. The main findings, something striking that you've learned new or that struck you during this conference. I suggest we start with you and then with the rest of the panel, and I will go to sit.
But before that, I think we should thank François for organizing everything of that. This is how you get a raise.
Okay, so I think this week was pretty great, seeing kind of the latest state of things. So I'm going to leave my sort of first prompt for the end after we go around. But the thought that I had, which I thought was most striking, was the evolution in some of the modeling that I've seen in this conference that was presented. You know, the first couple of days looking at, starting to look at some of the connections between what these numerical models can tell us, specifically the global models, to some of what the geology can tell us. So I'll stop there.
First one then. If I'm biased towards surface activities, of course, but so I would quote something that we've discovered that I think is a distribution of carbonates in fluvial settings and lacustrine settings. Those minerals, now it's kind of the first time Curiosity, we found this siderite. This was a total surprise. We did not expect it there. And it's a mineral that's, as you know, very intimate to how the climate machinery is working on Earth and enabling life. So to me, it's an important step that we start to discover the details of that. We knew there were carbonates on Mars. They were a bit elusive. But those fine details spotted in a crater, in craters now at Jezero and in Gale, I think is a start for a mineral that is both related to the atmosphere and the geological record. Now we can work in the details. We didn't have details before, and now we're starting to have them.
So the striking fact I learned in this conference is that Mars did not evolve through a very simple monotonic from transient warm and wet climate to the cold and dry climate, so that is today. So even during the Noachian and Hesperian, so Mars experienced the transient warming seasons due to the greenhouse gases, and even the Amazonian eras, so some kind during the high obliquity seasons, so Mars experienced water active eras. So yeah, so that is so great for me.
And I'll insist on that. I really enjoyed, and this is going to be a digestion of the first 2 days, seeing this transition from a discussion of the baseline climate of early Mars between warm and wet and cold and icy to, I think, a much more pertinent discussion of obliquity cycles, glacial and interglacial periods. And, like the Noachian is becoming more similar to the Amazonian, and the Amazonian is becoming more similar to the Noachian. And this is really interesting. And I'm really excited that we are starting to discuss transient and obliquity changes in early Mars also.
Yeah, you two have taken the words out of my mouth. That was exactly what I was going to say. So I wanted to add some details to that. That I really enjoyed that shift is coming from all directions. So it's the more detailed models, the more detailed surface observations from remote sensing, but also the rovers, we see that. So I think that's really an exciting time because it means that those stories can also come together in the near future.
I guess this is a bit related, actually. We had the same takeaways. My big takeaway is that gullies are still very controversial. But in all seriousness, learning from Lenka and Susan and Bethany and others just how prevalent active processes are, and being reminded how active present-day Mars is and how active the Amazonian probably was, even though we tend to think of it as sort of it got cold and locked up and sat there for 1 billion years. But hearing about the rapid increase since we started observing in CO2 gully formation and talking about recent snow on Mars got me really excited about those present-day processes.
Well, to me, I think it's the fact that we are finally, maybe, after tens of years of development, managing to have a good view of what was Mars a few million years ago only. Like, for instance, the subsurface water ice at mid-latitude has been discovered by Barnett in 2009, and it took us like almost 15 years to have a good explanation, or at least a reliable explanation for its distribution and so. So it took some time, but at least now we have a self-consistent framework to study the many faces of Mars, and I'm sure that in 10 or 15 years, we'll see that we were wrong again, but this means that we have improved our physics and our understanding of Mars.
Okay, well, let's see if I can articulate my first prompt properly. Y'all have covered a lot of things that I think that feed into this, so that's great. And then I want to encourage, obviously, the audience, as you have additional questions or follow-ons, to come down and ask some of the panelists about their opinions on this. And the sort of thought that I had as we were going through this conference is it's a very different conference than or a very different topical discussion than when I was going through grad school. When I was going through grad school, we ended up in this conversation where we were still trying to reconcile composition with the morphology of the Martian surface. And we weren't really at this point of having this very sophisticated framework where you can actually start to link those observations to physical processes necessarily, right? That was evolving from the composition and the morphology into sort of the geological history. And so the thing that got me really thinking about in this conference was we can kind of take that next step, which is now to go all the way to a physical model that can tell us something about the evolution of the planet, what it was like millions, billions of years ago, how you can kind of reconcile the geology. And this actually kind of played out pretty well, I think, in the gully conversation with, is there enough lab work or, whatever or the physical model to support potentially what the observations are telling us. And so I think my question that I want maybe some on the panel and then some in the audience to address is, how and what should we do in the next decade or 2 decades, and where should we focus our effort to provide the best constraints we can from the observations to support the best modeling we can do as a community? Because I look at still, I think the early Mars atmosphere, right? That still to me is kind of this, I think somebody even put it on their slide, right? The magic, 15% H2, right? And like, okay, well, what can we do to help try to constrain, some of these early planetary conditions, and how can the geology story help us reconcile some of these modeling questions? And so I'm curious if the panelists have any thoughts on that. That could be, by the way, from early Mars with H2 to modern day Mars with maybe there's water gullies or CO2 ice gullies, all these kinds of things. So I think that's where I'd like to start this conversation.
My first thought when you mentioned that is I think it mostly priority to, I would think of sample return because it's an ongoing program that has problems. And a way to think of it and to advocate for it, to keep advocating for it to happen, is to think of what do we do on Earth to get atmospheric estimation of early Earth. We go to the field and take samples. And what do we do on the sample? So as climate, I'm not a modeler, so of course I won't comment in details, but it seems to me we can advocate for that sample return by realizing that, what is the potential of those samples? Some of them have recorded, they are geologic samples, so they are rocks, but some of them are rocks from atmospheric processes. One of the latest we collected has a potential to have trapped atmospheric sample in there from early process, so from an early atmosphere. There is a huge potential of all the things we can do from this trapped atmospheric sample there. So that's the first priority that came to mind, is this ongoing program that is going for issues and needs likely advocacy from groups that, from our group as a whole, from our community. If we want to make it happen or not, we have to advocate also for it. So that's the initial thought I had.
So the next step to the case. So the from the GCM modeler. So most of GCM is focusing on the how to create the early Mars warm and wet. So to construct the warm and wet early Mars. So we usually assume the hydrogen-rich atmosphere, and so we LMD group and Japanese and other GCM groups can succeed to create the warm and wet climate. Geologists say they say on Mars there are many geological and geochemical rocks, and so we GCM cannot in the present stage express all of the geological evidence. So the next step, our GCM, we should consider the more sophisticated and updated our model to reconcile the geochemical, geological evidence such as the water rock reaction and groundwater activity. So in the present day, early Mars and present day Mars, I think.
Well, I think I'm going to surprise everyone in the room and say that as a glaciologist, I think we should send a radar. Why should we do that? Because, you know, like in the last 10 years on Earth, we've done a significant advance in our understanding of the internal structure and dynamics of the Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheets. And we can see layering in the Antarctic ice sheet down to the base at around 4 kilometers. We can see layers at a resolution of 55 centimeters. Now think about what that means if we're able to see that structure in Martian ice deposits. And I'm not necessarily advocating for the like super high resolution shallow radar. No, I think like about a proper synthetic aperture radar, a multiband radar that can actually allow us to constrain both dust content and fine stratigraphy and high resolution, and see if all these things we're seeing in the southern polar layer deposits, all this like large scale deformation, all of these possible subglacial takes. Is that a thing even? Are we seeing that? I think the next frontier is geophysics, sending, I talk about radar, but the other obvious one would be gravity, like early Mars. Those craters that are missing from the record, are they missing because they're covered by sediments, or are they missing because they were never there? And the way to do that would be high resolution gravity, and we haven't flown a gravimeter in years, and it would be so cheap. So I think really what we should be looking at is geophysics.
I can advocate for my own stuff as well, but I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to actually ask a question back to you, William. So if we get sample return back, and I would be very much in favor of that, then still we have quite a limited time captured, right? So I'm also trying to think of ways that we could constrain this atmosphere of Mars, both in like pre-Noachian, Noachian, but also in the Hesperian, because that seems to be a bit of a forgotten period sometimes as well. If there are other ways, maybe with rovers on the ground or other simpler missions without taking anything back, that we could do that, if you see that in some capacity as well, like having experience with that kind of data.
Yeah, if I understand, it seems to me that a lot of models also rely on the microphysics, the complexity at the microscale, and this is precisely what samples would do in a way. For instance, the dust. The dust don't come back through the Mars meteorite. There is no sample of dust. The sample will bring back dust for sure, even if we don't like it, or we will like it, I'm sure. And it will be the first time we can understand Mars dust. And this has tremendous implication on how we understand the current climate.
Yeah, so you think that bringing those samples back will teach us much more than only the localities that we actually see, because it makes it easier to interpolate. And
yes, I think the sample will teach us more than we pretend they could teach us. I mean, there's surprises in there, I'm sure. So.
And then I'm going to quickly advocate for my own stuff. I think it would be really nice to have higher resolution thermal data as well, because then we could both answer questions on glacial processes, on gullies, on really present day surface processes in the late Amazonian, because I think what I also realized with our discussion that we also had with Bethany about the gullies, we don't even really seem to understand the latest period very well. So there's so many constraints that we still need to fully understand also the cycling through the climate in the late Amazonian. Yeah.
I'll always advocate for higher resolution thermal data. I'm going to pull the direction back a little bit to sample return, but I think we, after listening to the talks on the first 2 days, I was taking notes, and I have a big, we don't understand amorphous materials, and they make up a huge amount of the rocks on Mars from what we've seen from orbit and from rovers, and I expect we'll see it in the samples when they come home to us. And I think we really need a lot of active research in modeling, laboratory experiments, and looking in Earth analogs to really understand how amorphous mineraloids and nanocrystalline materials form and how they get preserved in the rock record. I think Bryony mentioned on day one, there's a great paper by Becky Smith that shows 10 million-year-old rocks with 40% amorphous material from volcanic soils. These were heavily weathered. They have aluminum-bearing clays in them, but they're really old by Earth standards. And so we need to go look at even older rocks and go see what got preserved there and really think about what that means for the surface of Mars and its past climate.
Well, in terms of climate modeling, I think the most useful thing to do right now is to go to Antarctica. First, because I want to go there. Second, because I think if we want to understand how the surface has been shaped by the atmosphere, to understand the interaction between the subsurface, the surface, and the atmosphere, and the overall view of the planetary boundary layer and the volatile exchanges, we need to validate our models. And to do so, for instance, we need to have estimate and measurements of surface fluxes, either water vapor, heat, energy, and so on. And there's no one of that on Mars, actually. Even the rover, we cannot estimate that. And for that, the only place we can go, actually, is like the dry valley of Antarctica. And for instance, the modeling work I've presented this morning, we had to validate our model to estimate the quantities involved. And for that, we use a few measurements that we had, but it's not enough, actually. So if we want to really have a reliable model, we must rely on measurement on Earth analogs. And I think this is what is lacking so far.
And we need to go soon before they're not the dry valleys anymore.
You mean going to Antarctica or ice polar region to understand the physics of related to ices, or is that what you mean?
Understand the physics, validates our model. There's a lot actually to do, and that we learn. Also, it's just because it's a large lab actually. Like also, we need lab experiment, of course. But the main thing I'm thinking is going there actually goes, as you said, before it disappears.
I agree.
Thanks.
But I think a note of caution with terrestrial analogs, it's oftentimes forgotten the fact that Mars has a gravity that's much lower than terrestrial gravity, and it has pressure, temperature, and timescales that are very different. And I think that when using terrestrial analogs, it's a good thing to visualize how things may be happening, but we should not let that bias us. Because I think that has happened, like, for example, like looking at Lonnekes gullies, and, you know, like, we've been thinking so hard about terrestrial analogs that sometimes we cannot see other processes that may be going on, or other physics that may be going on that we don't have a clear, obvious example. But I agree that, like, on Earth, it's either Antarctica or the high Arctic, the most obvious places.
I agree, just that, for instance, I will just illustrate with an example that we have this year. For instance, the winds measured by InSight show a dramatic collapse at night. Like when there is a sunset, the winds almost vanishes. And we have no idea of what actually, why it was that. When we look at the Mars PCM, for instance, the model did not predict that. And then using actually some collaboration with people on Earth, measurement and so on, we have developed in a collaborative framework such an improvement that using what has been made in Antarctica with the measurement plus the modeling and applying it to Mars, it works super well. It was a super nice story, actually, and I really enjoy this part during my PhD. And I think we really need to do this collaboration again. I totally agree that we don't have to be like a mask and say, oh, if it's happening like this on Earth, it's like that on Earth. But I think it's a good input for us, actually.
So I also want to make sure that folks in the audience know that they should come up and ask questions or state their own opinions.
Can I add one little thing? I think just sort of the physicality of what you mentioned is really important. I really enjoyed actually during the conference that there was quite a lot of fieldwork talks and experimental talks, because I think maybe this is underlining what you just said, Anna, but experimenting with materials like Adam showed is so important because we don't really understand it if we can't see it on Earth. Francois, you started the conference with we needed to reinvent geology all the time, and I think in a way we're still maybe doing that for Mars.
So from a climate perspective, I think we have two records that we completely overlook. First, we have the stratigraphy of the MPLD, physical stratigraphy, but we also have a physical stratigraphy of the subsurface ice, if you think about it as a polar cap laying on the side. And another record that for me is super important and completely constrains the physical processes is the isotopic ratio. On Earth, we use it so much in Antarctica to learn about the past. And on Mars, it's even more important since we have lost to space, and we can maybe, again, either the polar stratigraphy or the on the side laying stratigraphy of the mid-latitude. And for me, as someone who modeled climate for the past 10 years, can give me really good constraints, and if I'm modeling correctly or completely not. It's important for me to know that I'm right, of course.
Or sending a helicopter down an icy scarp.
We don't need an helicopter. We need a rover, a very small one who can go and drill 10 centimeters. It's not hard. Capture, make the experiments. Come on, there are so many engineers here. Just make a rover for me.
Adam Valentinus, ETH Zurich. So just one comment about what's great about this conference and about all these, so the connection between the atmospheric modeling and the geological observations that, basically Jim and Francois, kind of kickstarted this. It's great, these kind of interdisciplinary connections. So I think for the future, we have to continue building these connections and really start thinking about laboratory synthesis experiments where we actually, the lab people also talk with the rover geologists, and then the rover geologists collaborate with the atmospheric scientists. So these kind of interdisciplinary connections can bring about new ideas and new perspectives. And I think that's really great what we have in the Mars community, because it's so rare actually in other sciences where you have all these different methodologies and different perspectives of tackling these questions. So it's, I just think we have to continue and even improve on, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I would just comment on that because you make me think of our future observations should favor this aspect. Like, I think, of course, discoveries come from our expertise. Deepening our expertise in modeling will bring things, but indeed, being able to talk to each other is also important. And our heritage is not easy for that. I find that the rover we've landed travel short distances, and so we become experts of a specific crater. And so we know in detail, but we have a hard time talking to people who map Mars globally, because then something doesn't make necessarily sense for the whole region. So that's why, so Anna mentioned it, that's why I'm pushing, I believe a lot in helicopters and drones for future exploration. For two reasons. It's promised to be much lighter, much cheaper. And it promises to study entire region using new types of instruments. We can bring magnetometer, we can bring radar sounders, we can bring chemical analyzers, but travel entire regions. So the communities that study things in detail in situ, this bring very detailed data, can talk to the communities that are mapping Mars in general and providing models for the whole system. In a way, it's like studying the larger structure. We've been stuck in craters that are tiny places. It has merit, of course. It's like in archaeology, you go and you study the trashes. You learn a lot about an ancient civilization by studying the trashes. But at some point, you won't learn about the Coliseum if you don't go to see the Coliseum. So you need to go see the big structure this way. So.
Jim Head, Brown University. I want to underline and emphasize the role of essentially terrestrial analogs. I spent 5 field seasons in Antarctica and 1 in the Arctic, and it's like different time scales potentially, and different environments, with the Arctic being more like maybe the Noachian and the essentially Amazonian more like, in fact, dry valleys. And of course, I know it's not Mars. I can breathe there, okay, so I know that. But what you learn from the processes, several people pointed out, is really important. You learn how processes work, and then you can scale those to Mars. So having said that, I want to take one additional challenge for you, because there are environments on Mars which we don't think about very much because we don't have good terrestrial analogs. I work a lot on the moon, and impact basins are critically important. They define almost everything about the geological history of the moon. And we don't consider those very much. And I emphasized in my initial comments that we think, in fact, that a lot of the phyllosilicates are produced almost instantaneously by hot rains. And that can actually define the baseline. And I think that's another area that we need to look at in much, much more detail. So the role of the basins and how they can affect the global mineralogy. Challenge for you.
I just wanted to make a note on the terrestrial analogs. I completely agree with terrestrial analogs have a place and a use, and they're incredibly good at illustrating how things happen and what can we expect from them. And I'm the first to show everyone pictures of the Devon Island channels. But I do think there's a value in scaling those analogs, like we would scale laboratory experiments. And I think that that's something that is not usually really done or thought about. And I think it would be useful to try to do that.
One thing that I often tell my early career grad students when they think about planetary analogs is how, you can't get a perfect planetary analog, right? You have to pick and choose. It's a chemical analog, it's a mineralogical analog, it's a analog process, it's an analog environment, et cetera. And so I think it's one of these, like you said, Jim, it's a super important constraint. Just has to be taken with the right context, right? You're not going to, like you said, I'm not going to Antarctica and it's all of a sudden every process that operates in Antarctica operates on Mars, but you are clever and careful with what you're looking for, and you can then do that translation, like you said. And then I think the other part that you raised that was, I think, Lucas, you talked about this briefly, but the connection to sort of lab studies, that was another very interesting thing that I saw here where, classically, I guess I would say, is there's been relatively small amount of sort of process analog lab studies. You look at Ron Greeley and wind tunnels and things like that back in the day, but this is some of the first time that I've seen flow type analogs in the flume in that environment, right? Because you're still obviously missing gravity, but there are scaling parameters and equations that you can use to cross that out, right? So anyway.
I would like to add to that. I think both the field and the lab also helps to visualize processes that we have. It's hard to understand. So the field works for the longer time scales, and then the lab works for the actual processes that are unknown to us here on Earth. And I think just being able to share them here makes it easier to also talk to each other sort of cross fields, because then everyone has an idea with it, if you can actually visualize what might be happening.
Adam Valentinus, ETH Zurich. So yes, great comment about the helicopter idea. I think also this is the scales. We need to really be able to travel long distances to be able to explore all these different environments, because we have to also remember that most of the rovers, they went to lake environments, Gale, and Jezero, and there are so many different other environments on Mars that we haven't explored from ground. We know many of them quite well from orbit. We know that there's a lot of mineralogical diversity. So I think what will be interesting in the future to observe and analyze from ground are those areas and these settings where we do see a lot of different minerals, and maybe we actually don't have very good Earth analogs for them, but once you go to these areas, you might find something very, very interesting and very something that we didn't expect, before. So, for example, I can think of a few areas on top of my head in the Southern Highlands because they're super ancient, and you do see sometimes examples that may hint to subsurface hydrothermal activity, and they're not lake environments. So I just think, for the future, if we have these helicopters, maybe we can go fly there where a lander could not land, for example, and explore these environments.
I agree also for that, for active surface processes. Swarm of drone would be great, because then we could actually see stuff happening. And it's not only gullies, it's also aeolian, it's also ice and dark spots and other weird stuff happening with the seasonal caps.
To comment on that is, indeed there was a reason we ended up in lakes with rovers. Is that rovers, of course, were the things we knew how to do, and we tried and we were successful. But indeed, it's not. We were obsessed by finding biosignatures and habitable environment. But lake is not the only. It's only a consequence of a whole system, of a whole planet that can sustain it. There is rivers and things, and the limitation is also we also approach this by our obsessions, knowing we have big questions, but once they broaden, then indeed we come to realize we need to go to other places. We have assumed, for instance, we've seen volcanoes from orbit. Okay, it's a volcano. It's a glacier. It's a glacier. But if we come to see them in details, wouldn't we be surprised by what we find? We can't really tell yet. We assumed, we know volcanoes. We've seen them on Earth. But if we actually go there and see the material in detail, There are things like that. So in J0, there is a mantling unit made of olivine, which defies any conception of what a rock is like that. So it doesn't make sense. It's an olivine cumulate, which is supposed to be a magmatic chamber, and we see it over draping the surface on above. So anyway, there are plenty of things to do just by going to places we assumed we knew.
Before you go, Bruce. So one of the things that I think that you were just bringing up, William, is the key that you only explore some tiny amount of the Martian surface with landers and rovers, right? And the way to extrapolate those things, I think, is still something that a lot of the remote sensing community for Mars still kind of struggles to deal with. How do you take these, whatever, millimeter scale observations from a rover and then turn them into an interpretation for a crater, and then how do you take that crater and turn it into interpretation for a region, and then how do you take that region and turn it into interpretation for a globe? And I think, again, this is like early my time, but maybe not early Bruce time. Sorry, Bruce. It's all right.
You're going to be as old as I am one day.
I know. But when I was going through grad school, again, it was sort of this relatively simple idea of Mars, and I feel like the community had this kind of revelation in the early 2000s that no, this is like a very complicated planet thanks to a whole bunch of new observations that came around, right? And it's this very dynamical system, and from Viking, where you saw these channels, and Mariner, where you saw these big channels, and it was like, oh, there's a lot of water, and then we stopped doing anything basically for 20 plus years until Mars Global Surveyor came around, and then obviously all of the other spacecraft to follow. So I think that reinvigoration of those types of things is pretty important, and I do worry about that with the current climate of science in the US, and so I think it's interesting to see how ESA, we heard talk about this earlier, is looking how to, repurpose the sample return orbiter, and I think that's a great thing to continue to be, flexible in these times right now as well. So anyway, go ahead, Bruce. Sorry I called you old.
I want to underscore what you said before that last couple of sentences, that we're increasingly seeing that the questions we're asking about Mars are interdisciplinary in nature. I think I've seen this more at this conference than anywhere else, that the geology affects the atmosphere affects the geology, the interior, the upper atmosphere. We didn't see too much of that here, but it's very important in affecting the climate and the volatile inventory. And this conference, I think, has been better than most because we've got everybody in the room at once. You look around and it's one session, everybody's talking to everybody else. Most people made a real effort to talk to the whole room rather than the 4 experts. If I compare this to the relatively recent International Mars Conference in Pasadena, that was parallel sessions. I went to the climate session, other people went to the geology session, and you didn't have a chance to explore the interdisciplinary nature of it. So I think that as we go forward, it's that lack of stovepiping and the interdisciplinary nature, the coupling of all the components of the system that are going to end up being important.
I think that's so important. I just found out this year, I have 5 colleagues working on different degrees of rubber missions that did not know that there were glaciers on Mars.
There are glaciers on Mars?
Well, what am I doing here?
Maybe also, Bruce, and I don't know how that was, but I can also imagine that over time the Mars community, with more data coming in, also grew a lot. So then you get very specialized people that do atmosphere or do glaciers and then you lose each other. And yeah, it's nice that we find each other then again.
I agree with that, Lannika. I think it's very hard to be interdisciplinary, especially early in your career. You need to focus in, you need to pick one problem and work on it. And not everybody needs to be interdisciplinary, but as a community, we need to be. And maybe it only takes a few people who are really looking across all the problems, but as long as there's that connection between the different components of the system, I think we're going to address the right questions.
would agree with that. I think even just staying aware of what is happening in the other fields, like I love keeping up with what curiosity does. I think is important because you never know when the collaboration might pop up. But it does mean effort because you need to branch out and use your brain.
I'd like to emphasize follow-up interdisciplinary with international. I think it's critically important. This is a wonderful thing about this conference and many others like this, is that it is in fact international conference. And I would just like to emphasize, I'm sorry to hear that I haven't heard much about the Chinese Zhurong mission. And it's 1.2 kilometers from across contact 2 of the ocean. There's a lot of information there. It's all available. NAOC in Beijing hosts a Chinese PDS. You can download a lot of the data there, et cetera. So I really encourage you to take all the Chinese data into consideration. They have an orbiter, okay? They have a lot of data coming down. They have the results of the Zhurong rover, and they're really, really fascinating. There's tons of things there. So, but I'd like to really emphasize 2 fundamental points for the future. The first one is, what were the starting conditions in terms of the amount of water that accreted at Mars? That's a big unknown, and that's the beginning. That sets the stage. The second one is, what's the relationship of the primary and the secondary atmosphere? Primary atmosphere is what accretes and produces that initial set of abundance of water. But again, we have big basins. They're stripping off a lot of the atmosphere. They're stripping off a lot of the water. We really need to understand what's the relationship of those starting conditions are with what comes in the secondary atmosphere, which is largely derived from the interior. So those are just challenges I'd like to emphasize.
It brings up another question of interdisciplinary, Jim, thanks, of solar system accretion. This is something a lot of us don't study. Bring some astronomers into the conversation. Sorry, probably there's some in the room. I don't know why I'm on this panel.
Okay, so the thing that I guess I wanted to raise next associated with this is, so we talked a little bit about what measurements we think the panel here and maybe others in the audience want to chime into, think are kind of critical for upcoming assessments to sort of improve these things. But I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more, both from the audience and the panel, about what lab measurements, what geological measurements, what sort of field measurements, things like that can help place better constraints and parts of the models that y'all are developing for GCMs or radiative transfer models or whatever, that would really help kind of advance forward some things. For example, so like we were talking about, and I know Francois and Bethany were arguing about this earlier, about how much salt is needed to melt water under these Mars conditions, right? And how much does that play into it? And maybe we need to know the exact geochemistry of the dust, right? And maybe that's a real question that could be answered in the future. So I guess I'm just curious if people have opinions on what the next types of measurements would be, both from what we can provide from surfaces aspect to what the GCMs need to be better constrained for early Mars, for present day Mars, things like that. I don't know who that question is asked to, so somebody.
I could answer not specifically to GCM, but related to that is I think the elephant in the room since the beginning is the models of maybe it relates to what James has mentioned, is that we don't have a good constraint on scenarios for global crust formation. Even initially and the secondary crust, though it's there, it's preserved on Mars. Likely some of the earliest possible crust we could find is on Mars. And the primary mineralogy, to understand where the magmatic processes, the dominant processes, where they're impact related, where they're internally driven, all those things, we didn't go to the places to understand that in situ. We went to sedimentary basins that are altered. And from orbit, unfortunately, primary mineralogy is hard to read. And so it's still the big, we have models that are up in the air to explain the dichotomy, and they have no constraint. So I think the sample return will partially answer that, because J0 has important, outside of J0 notably, there are samples that are from the mantle and crust, lower crust, from das breccia that lack a bit of context, but still will bring extremely valuable info. But as a whole, there are places on Mars to go to understand the first stage, how the stage was built and how the crust was built globally initially. It has two merits. It's just for the sake of understanding Mars, but also on the Earth, the record is gone, and we can only speculate on how the continents were first born and how the first crust of the Earth arrived. And so, and the other merit of that is once we understand those mothers and we put constraint on them, we can understand exoplanets and planets in general of terrestrial type.
Yeah, I think so. These are definitely important. I mean, samples I think are definitely critical for not only the people working in the lab and doing isotopic measurements and doing the mineralogy and understanding the the volcanic history and the aqueous history of the planet, but I mean these samples are also important for atmospheric people. It's important for you can extend it beyond to the solar system evolution and as well as to exoplanets. And in the exoplanet community, they're so constrained up with the amount of methods that they use. Everything is based on remote sensing basically. So all of these fundamental pieces of information that Mars science can provide, I think is super critical. And the second comment is, I think the elephant in the room is life. So life on Mars, on ancient Mars, present-day Mars, maybe not. But if it ever evolved on ancient Mars, the question is, did it cling to Mars and did it migrate somewhere else, maybe in the subsurface? Just because we know on Earth was habitable, even though there were major catastrophes. And once life evolves, it's very likely that possibly it's just very good at sticking around. So I think it's very important, this question. And yeah, what do I want to say?
It's more the microbe in the room, right?
Yeah, microbial life. Yeah, probably. Yeah, but I just think we have to be critical of finding potential biosignatures. Of course, we have to reflect on it and understand all these abiotic processes. But I think thinking of life, we should definitely do as a community, because that's the main driver of, I would say, in my opinion, or one of the main drivers of Mars future, is trying to understand this fundamental question of has a life ever evolved in a solar system apart from Earth, and if so, where else? And if Mars is a good place to look for life, actually.
Yeah, I agree. Life is of course a driver, but it's life. You cannot remove it from its environment. So understanding the environment has an intrinsic merit with regard to that. Understanding how life was born in an environment, likely we don't know how it emerged, but if it emerged, we know right now once emerged, it's entirely shaped for the environment, and then it shaped even the environment itself, and they are intrinsically related, linked. So if we want to find life, we also should find environments and characterize that globally. So both are extremely related.
Yeah, yes, I mean, and in the Earth record, we see that life is so intimately linked with the geology that sometimes it's difficult to say what's life and what's geology. And so, then you can extrapolate this idea that, maybe at least Earth life needs a terrestrial body, needs a rock. So can you look at other rocky planets and try to understand if it could have originated? So I think it's super exciting time, I think, for Mars science.
Can I quickly come back to the question you asked? For measurements, I think what I've distilled from the talks this week is that there's actually quite a lot of questions still related about how different ices behave close to the surface. And I don't think that we can start to experimentally do glacial flow, because we can't even do that on Earth. Imagine having to account for lower gravity. But I do think the melting and the sublimating of CO2 and H2O ice under different Martian atmospheric compositions, impurities, combinations, and I mentioned something interesting also about wind and the influence of wind taking it away and wind influencing partial pressure. I think that's all things that we actually experimentally could do, and maybe it's a bit, in a way, seems boring science because it's not the flashy thing that gives the most interesting results and big claims for your Nature and Science papers, but it's important underlaying all the model physics. So.
Related to ice, I think what we are missing the most is our understanding of the evolution of the microphysics of ice. We have plenty of measurement, for instance, of a to understand the structure of an northern polar cap. We see that it's much more complex than we thought. For instance, we don't understand the bright albedo, but the large grain size. We don't understand like why we have almost clean ice sheet in the subsurface and so on. And this is because we don't understand, and I think never correctly model, the evolution from a snow deposit to ice, to understand the remnant of ice that we have today. And to do so, we can use model, but for instance, the two model I know in the literature estimate the snow metamorphism rate from 1,000 years to millions of years. So we need to have correct models to do that, but we also need lab experiments actually to constrain these time scales. And this is really critical to rely on models to understand the snow deposition and now the remnant that we have. I think this is the next goal for the 5-10 years in terms of modeling and lab experiments.
Sorry, can I comment on that? I don't want to step on what Anna's going to say, but this feels like another moment for interdisciplinary because the ice core community does so much of this observationally, and I'm not sure how much is modeled. How much is like experimented in the lab to try to recreate what you're seeing, and some of that includes flow. So this may not be applicable, but there's lots of ice domes that don't experience flow where you could go and look at these stages, start to put some constraints on the model.
Coming back to ice metamorphism, this is one of the typical things that like people have been assuming that it works a specific way for like generations. Nobody has actually looked at it. And when people start looking at it, they're like, oh, wait a second, maybe liquid water is not a thing. Oh, wait a second, we have a problem with pressure. Oh, wait a second, how does ice, like, water or vapor diffusion occur through the matrix? And then you start piling up things and you actually realize that you don't know anything about it. So I completely agree with you. I think this is something where you need both measurements in places where sublimation dominates, like in Antarctica, for example, and lab experiments.
And to jump in what Bruce said about the interdisciplinary, I know, for instance, that a lot of people are investing a lot in building models for the exploration of Europa, Ganymede, and so on, to really understand the icy structures of these bodies. And I think we should try actually to reach also this community because they are dealing with same issue as us, like the grain size, the effect of salts, and so on. And I think we can learn a lot from them and bring their expertise on Mars, and also to tell them our expertise. I think it's also an interdisciplinary thing that we should do.
Apart from that community, I think there's also a whole community of astrophysicists looking at ice, and of course, forms really far out the solar system, and maybe that's very different, but they probably do know quite a lot about the microphysics of ice, so maybe it's also good to reach around past that aisle. Although maybe they speak a very different language, and also it's hard, but yeah, maybe worth it.
Go for it, Francois.
I will change subject. Among the big question, I wanted to mention something that has not been discussed at all this week. It's what happened before 4.1 billion years ago in our typical. And the reason is that theoretical models, still simple, suggest that there were no atmosphere on Mars because you could not keep it because of the thermal escape of whatever you have, including CO2, with such a high UV and X-ray radiation from the sun. So it's very striking. For us modeler, I think we have still to work more on exploring if this is robust when you have a more complex model. But I'm really wondering, it's a question to the community, is there a way we can investigate what happened, or should we realize that maybe what we see, the beautiful Noachian records, actually corresponding the first time Mars actually had an atmosphere? Another question is, were there an atmosphere on Mars when Hellas or Hygiea were formed? And because it's really, when we compute, it's really the end of it's the time when at last in this scenario, Mars could grow up an atmosphere. But remember that, I'm convinced that before 4.1 billion years ago, there were no atmosphere on Mars. So you have to grow something after that, and then you have valley networks, and then nothing else. No, I'm kidding. It's a nice planet.
I think maybe then back to William, the sample return, but then for something really old could show us that.
Maybe these rocks are already really
Because that could answer that question. So we need pre-Noachian rocks back to Earth and
Need some really old Martian meteorites.
There are terrains, early Noachian terrains available on Mars. We just didn't go there yet. So at least going there and getting petrological measurement, what the rocks tell us about the environment of formation, what's the magmatic environment that leads to these rocks, their volatile content and things like that, can tell us how effective the gassing was at that time. Unfortunately, we didn't go there yet. Oxia is one early Noachian. What would we find? In Oxia is an interesting area that is heavily cratered, so we would have to deal with cratering. There are other places like what is the crust exposed at the base of Valles Marineris on the east, for instance, that is not heavily cratered but very deep crust. Yeah, that's what's.
I actually want to go back to the discussion we were having just a moment ago about interdisciplinarity in science, and how the example of how some people didn't know that there were glaciers on Mars, right? Back when I was in school, we were just coming of age in recognizing that everything was intertwined and interconnected. And as an atmospheric scientist, I was eager to learn more about the geology and how that interacted with the atmospheres. Here we are some number of years, decades later. But we're asking the same questions, right? It feels to me like academia is not approaching this type of science in the right way. We go to school to become an atmospheric scientist or a geologist or a geophysicist or stovepiped disciplines. So my question actually for all of you is, what would the ideal planetary science program teach you that you would come out of it feeling like you understand Mars or take whatever planet you want as a system, as something that you can contribute in a new way that the current academic structure doesn't allow?
A really good question. We're having that discussion in our department right now. I think the short answer is everything. As a Sousson at the beginning, you should have to learn a little bit of everyone's disciplines, enough to be dangerous, and then specialize.
Adding to that, I wonder if that's possible in like 3 years bachelor plus 2 years master. Okay, it's possible. Maybe also part of it is, they take a lot longer than Americans. Okay, I think in Europe at least 5 years is too short, and then you have 4 years PhD where you have to specialize. So I think maybe the whole system then needs to be overturned because we need to specialize. But you also need some specialized knowledge. So I think it's mostly important that you learn to speak the language of the other. So I agree with you on that. And maybe this feeds into sort of the more general discussion in science about the amount of papers that we're publishing, and we just need to run. And maybe we need to actually sit and talk to each other a bit more and find that more important than the amount that we actually publish, because then we have time to learn to speak each other's languages.
Maybe give a more specific answer to the question. You were in the school in Les Houches, and I think that provided a really, really good overview of everything from astrobiology to interior to surface to atmosphere. And I think it'd be really important to touch on each one of those subjects a little bit during the master's or PhD program, and then let the student, come up with their own ideas to what they think they would like to contribute on and how, and actually try to feed that curiosity instead of trying to over specialize a master's program. So I don't know if that helps or not, but I particularly enjoyed that school. I thought that it was a very, very nice overview.
So in Japanese university, so we have the 4 years bachelor and 2 years master course and 3 years the doctor course. So it is so very short to know everything about the atmosphere and lithosphere. Yeah, all of them. So yeah, but so it is possible to make new you make the academic course for the generalist to forming generalist. Yeah.
Maybe a small remark on that is that indeed in the whole pipeline, when you first start, it can be overwhelming to attend the big conference. And I agree, the workshop like Les Ouches that are presented at schools, they had an impact on me when I was PhD. That was pretty positive, gave me the weapons to be confident more to approach field like Mars.
Do you want to say something, Luca?
I would just add while you're passing the mic, maybe the approach is that we don't need to become hyper-specific, that good science and good discoveries can come from just having a basic but broad knowledge, right? We tend to focus on, I'm going to study this little aspect of this subdiscipline of this area, and we all have our expertise, but there's nobody, I take that back. There are some, but it's not common to be someone who just this way instead of this way in their study. So maybe we need to revisit that approach of trying to make students focus on such a hyper-specific area and make them more Renaissance, as Renaissance men and women, rather than the hyper-specific.
But I think it does not only apply for students, but also for us, actually. And this is what Bruce said. During this week, we try to reach the largest audience possible by simplifying our language, not being just talking to experts. And I think this is something lacking in conference. I've been doing this job for 4 years only, but when you attend a conference, the first 2 slides, you understand something, and after a few slides, then you're lost. And this week, we really tried, actually, to keep together actually in the board by trying to explain without using too much excessive jargon, technical language and so on. And I think we should really also continue like that in big conference. It's super difficult because we now have 9, 8, 7-minute talks, so it's almost impossible. But this is how actually you create interconnection when you think you understand the constraint from the geology, for instance, for us climate models and vice versa. And I think it's super important to try to keep that. It's super difficult because of the format of the talks right now in big conference, but this is the most important. It's really difficult also for us to be aware of the other research in other fields actually because of that.
So we have only just a couple minutes left, so last comments, let's say.
So maybe I'm biased, but I remember when, as undergrad, when I came for the first day in physics degree, the dean came and said, I'm not going to teach you anything in this degree. The only thing I'm going to teach you is how to think and how to solve problems. And instead of being specific about teaching us normal faults or abnormal faults or Rossby wave or whatever, maybe we should, a planetary scientist who needs to interact in many disciplines needs to be able first to attack problems, be able to communicate to other people who are expert in other fields, and be able to look at a broad range, other than his own expertise. This is as an undergrad. Later on, as a graduate student or as a PhD student, you can be expert in one field, but know that your field always is connected to other fields you know less, and you be able to still be learning on your own by reading books or papers or interacting with other people. This is how I think planetary science should attack problems.
And just to follow up on that, and what it's been said to the point, I think that there's a point of like facilitating language across disciplines. And there's a point where at first we don't know very much about a specific landform or specific thing. And it's okay to call this a black three-legged metal feature. But at some point we actually discover it's a table. And then we should start calling it a table. And that's perhaps the reason why people don't know they didn't know there were glaciers on Mars, because we didn't call them glaciers. And I think facilitating language at a point where we're actually confident that we're looking at something is a way to communicate across disciplines.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with having problems. So instead of maybe saying problems, I would say questions. So questions can be very interdisciplinary and may require different tools and techniques to solve. So the way I like to look at it, there's nature, and there are different methods how you can study nature. So you have biologists, you have chemists, you have geologists, you have physicists, but they're all trying to understand nature more deeply. So it's all about the question, and then once you have the question, you basically select the tools that you need and the methods that you need to answer these questions.
So I want to go back, Christopher, to one of the first questions you asked, and that was what measurements we might need in order to make progress. And I want to raise something that hasn't come up here yet, but which I think is an important question, and that appears to be, how far should I be from the microphone?
You're good.
That's one of the most significant issues we face. When we ask questions about Mars and think about what measurements we need to address them, one of the things we haven't talked about is what we would get from human missions to Mars. I actually think that a lot of the questions we're asking are not going to be addressed without the data that comes back from human missions. The in situ geological interpretation with the remote sensing capability of our eyes and the computing power of our brains, along with thoughtful, intelligent samples and return to the Earth. When we think about that, what is it that we can do to address that? And I think the answer is there's a lot we don't know about Mars, but we need to know in order to be able to implement a human mission. So not just how do we answer the science questions, how do we enable human missions by learning more about the environment so we can properly design the missions and have them be successful. So I don't expect an answer, but I just wanted to throw that out as something that is of fundamental importance. But go ahead and answer.
Oh, no, I agree with you completely, Bruce. And I think whether we think it's going to happen soon or not, it's on the table. I agree with everything you were saying. This is how we got excellent geologic results from the moon, was sending people who can look at it and interpret it and say, oh, actually, let's pick up the dust, too. Not the first thing Neil did. So one of the things the Mars ice community is considering, and I'm sure you're well aware, is that, mapping shallow ice for in situ resource utilization. And it becomes an excuse to do a lot of things like look at small glaciers, and look, we're never going to get to that ice. It's 10 meters deep. But it becomes fundamentally important to understand where is the accessible water ice. And in doing that, you get to learn a lot more about the present-day environment and recent geologic past.
Without wanting to disagree with you, I'm going to somewhat disagree with you. And the first human missions are not going to rely on in situ resource utilization.
Well, no, because we don't want to drink Martian microbes. I'm just saying it's a great excuse for fun.
No, because it's really, really hard. And without knowing with some pretty high degree of confidence where there's water ice, I would not want to send somebody and say, land there and then find out if you're going to find the ice to get there.
Take a pickaxe and see if you can chop it up.
Okay, well, I think that should wrap this panel up. I just wanted to close with one thought for Francois also, which is that I personally thought that this was a very good interdisciplinary conference and workshop where we learned a whole lot of things. And so I hope that Francois and the LMD crew will consider hosting this again, maybe in a couple years. We'll see. Maybe I'll host it. in Flagstaff. We'll see. But I think it's a good type of conference to keep thinking about this cross-cutting kind of interdisciplinary approach. And I do agree that a lot of times we end up getting siloed, even within our subfield of Mars. And as a Mars scientist and planetary scientist and geologist, it's good to be reminded of some of these cutting-edge techniques that are coming around, so that you can then think about how you can implement them in your own work. And so again, with that, I'll just say, maybe someday we'll have another one of these conferences, and until then, think about the next decade and what you'd like to see from, or 2 decades, and what you'd like to see measurements be made, and then come back to Earth so we can better understand Mars and place some better constraints on things that we can't currently constrain very well. Okay.
So a final word, because we need a final word, is just to thank everyone. We are very grateful for all of you who came. Some of you came twice in a month to Europe because we had the DPS EPSC meeting, and you came back. And when you organize such a meeting, you always worry if people will trust that the meeting will be interesting. And many of you came. The best came, in fact. That's why it was delightful. So it's a little populist approach, but I want to thank all of you for coming, and this was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and don't forget 7 o'clock at Grand Central if folks are going. Ground control, not Grand Central. Ground control.